Afghanistan's national unity government fails to meet a two-year deadline for making electoral reforms and constitutional changes. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C., and this is The Heat. Under a governing agreement brokered by the United States in September of 2014, Afghanistan's national unity government was given 2 years to push through sweeping electoral reforms. The impasse has created tensions between President Ashraf Ghani and Chief Executive Abdullah and called into question the future of their government. We begin our coverage with CCTV's Catherine James in Kabul. And Catherine, the deadline is now expired for Afghanistan's national unity government. Why is electoral reform needed in the first place? And what happens next?
Right, well, the electoral reform was part of this mandate given to the national unity government because keep in mind the presidential election of Afghanistan back in 2014 happened in April, and by September there was still no clear winner from that election because of the systemic fraud that had happened throughout the country, including in Kabul, where there was a lot of oversight. So there was a complete distrust in the system, and hence John Kerry did step in and brokered this deal where both parties were given more or less a 50-50 split of power. And we had a president declared and a CEO declared, and they were given a mandate to ensure that electoral reforms were put in place in order for then future elections to take place, and they were given 2 years to do that. And that has not happened, and of course it has called into question the legitimacy of the government. However, as most people I've spoken to have said, what are the alternatives? We don't actually have a clear, strong front-runner to lead this country. So the best system is to continue with the national unity government as is. It's not going to suddenly disintegrate or fall apart. It will continue, and the pressure on them to deliver these reforms is really, really crucial in the coming months.
Now, one of the big issues in Afghanistan, corruption. It's been a recurrent problem. Has the current unity government been able to make any headway on combating corruption?
The presidency of Ghani has been very, very focused on this. There's a very mixed response when you talk about whether he's actually really been able to make headway. One of his moves was to try to really centralise a lot of the decisions being made in order to avoid it. But then there was a lot of resentment on that front because ministries and people in positions of decision making felt that they were having decisions taken out of their hands and directly given to the president. And so there was also concern about that. So Ghani has been making efforts, but they haven't always been very effective. And keep in mind that there has been some responsibility laid at the feet of the international community for the level of corruption that has been here. Just recently, a report put out by a third party, CIGAR, the kind of like a watchdog on the way money has been spent here, was really quite strong on the US's involvement in lack of oversight in how they were delivering aid to Afghanistan. And also keep in mind that we see now on the cusp of a big conference in Brussels on the future of Afghanistan will happen next week. And we've already seen yesterday, The Guardian reported that the European Union has said that their continued aid will depend on Afghanistan taking back refugees or asylum seekers from Europe. But you really have to question, like, if the European Union and these groups want to send people back and they're making aid contingent on Afghanistan taking people back, why not make it contingent on these reforms and these corruption reforms in order to stabilise a country that people would want to come back to? So really there is a question of the international community's response to this and the level of pressure they can put for more to be done on this front in order for it to really move forward.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. That's CCTV's Catherine James reporting from Kabul. Here with us in Washington, D.C. is Omar Samad. He served as the Afghan Ambassador to France and Canada and is currently the CEO of Silkroad Consulting. Also with us is Ahmad Khalid Majidyar. He's a political analyst and teaches U.S. military leaders on security and politics in Afghanistan. And we're joined by Mohammad Ali, who's a researcher and security analyst Ali recently served as senior advisor to Afghanistan's National Security Council. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Ambassador, let me start with you. Why has it been so difficult for the National Unity Government to formulate and implement these electoral and constitutional reforms?
Well, we need to go back about 2 years because this unity government is now 2 years old, and look at the end of that very complex and troublesome election that took place. As a result, there was no conclusive result, and we didn't have numbers to go by. And the United States and the United Nations stepped in, and they made an arrangement. An accord was signed, and there were certain points that had to be accomplished over the next month and weeks. Both sides agreed, and then the unity government was formed. It was supposed to deal with election issues right away. It was supposed to reform the laws that in Afghanistan conduct elections, and it was supposed to give way to the parliamentary elections that are supposed to be taking place this year. It was supposed to also put in place a new election commission because the old one had been discredited. All of this did not happen because, in my view, one side of the government was not too keen on pushing this, while the other side of the government, and speaking from the point of view of someone who was in government until a few months ago, was much keener to go ahead with reforms and the political process as per the accord that was signed in 2014. Since this did not happen as quickly as everybody anticipated it, it has over time built up and created sort of a crisis. But at this juncture right now, both sides that make up the unity government have realized that there's much more to lose than to gain by not going forward with reforms. There are some signs over the past few days that President Ghani is now more interested in showing some interest in going ahead with reforms and the election process and changing the laws of the country, which is welcomed by Abdullah, his counterpart.
So there's a recognition that reforms must be introduced. There's just a question of how quickly they come.
How quickly, and not only it's a matter of timing, which is essential. It should have started right away per the accord. It didn't. But also, who does it involve?
Right.
How do they select the individuals who are going to propose those reforms?
Okay. Ahmad, you've written that the political and security situation in Afghanistan is deteriorating. Given these political uncertainties in the country right now, how does that affect the security situation in the country?
Actually, the political crisis, which is intensifying in Kabul, is undermining the security initiatives that the government should take to deal with the resurgent Taliban at the moment. We know that the Taliban is right now more powerful than any time they were in 15 years. For the first time this year, they captured 2 provincial centers and briefly held that, although the Afghan security forces were able to take back with some coalition support. The government has lost about 5% of its territory to the Taliban. And it's not just now the Taliban. The criminal network has become more powerful. And also we have the new threat of the ISIS also just gaining ground in Afghanistan. But at the same time, now, while these 2 teams within the government, they are engaged in this political bickering, and that undermines a united effort that they have to take to devise just a security strategy to deal with that. We know that Afghanistan didn't have a defense minister for a very long time. And some of the the military appointments are also compromised because they're not just the right people. So that also just emboldens the Taliban and gives the Taliban an opportunity to spread their propaganda that the government is failing and we have just a chance for a military victory.
Ali, what is your view on this political crisis in Afghanistan right now? Why is there such rivalry, enmity between the 2 leaders?
Well, the problem is after the formation of the National Unity Government, both candidates, the chief executive and the president of the country, were supposed to go for electoral reform and constitutional reform, as they promised that they will do this in the next 2 years. But unfortunately, both of the candidates, both of the chief executive and President Ghani, were engaged in some sort of power politics, where that, undermined the electoral reform as well as the constitutional reform. So at the end, the chief executive came out and said, the president did not want to meet, and the real problem started. But the fact is that both candidates, right from the beginning, were engaged in power politics instead of delivering a promised reform to the Afghan people as well as to the international community.
So, Ambassador, as Ali says, the leaders are playing power politics right now. What happens if there's no reform? Can an election take place?
Well, at this point, as I mentioned, there are some signs that it's back on track. Now, is it because of the upcoming international conference that is taking place next week in Brussels, where the donors are supposed to gather and pledge for Afghanistan's development for the next 3 to 4 years? Is that the pressure that is sort of forcing them and encouraging them to work together again? Or is it a realization on the part of those who have not shown political will over the last 2 years that their political future also hinges on reforms and on a constitutional change and on everything that had been promised? Remember, we are talking about an accord, a political accord that was sealed in September of 2014. John Kerry supervised it. Right. The United Nations supervised it. And these two gentlemen signed it. What we are saying is that, and my perspective is that one side tried to pursue this accord and implement it, while another side tried to stall it for whatever political reasons they had. Now they have come to the realization, we hope, that things need to change and they need to work as partners in this endeavor and not as rivals. The rivalry is over. It's 2 years old. It's finished. Now is the time to, sort of work together and make sure that the country's political stability is assured, because as others said, security and the economy of the country, which is also badly hurt, are suffering. And the country cannot put up with all of these challenges at the same time.
Ahmad, I want to get to the security situation. The former Afghan president, Hamid Karzai, has been talking about this. He's been critical of the current government. He says that this government is allowing the United States he's given the United States freedom to conduct airstrikes against targets inside Afghanistan. Let's take a listen to what he said.
How could the U.S. president authorize troops to go and on their own launch attacks in Afghanistan? Don't we have a government here? Aren't we a sovereign country? Don't we own this country? Is the U.S. president in charge of Afghanistan? Or are we in charge of this country? That charge must return to Afghans.
Does the former president have a point there?
Well, most of the security and governance challenges that the current national unity government is facing is because of some of the policies of President Karzai. And especially in terms of security, President Karzai never wholeheartedly assumed the position of commander-in-chief. He never showed a determination to defeat the Taliban. He pursued a reconciliation policy, but his policy only empowered the Taliban because of unilaterally he released hundreds of Taliban prisoners without any concessions on the other side. And also in the same interview, he mentioned that if the Taliban just captures some parts of Afghanistan, they are Afghans and they have a right to do so. Although he recanted that position after some pressure by the civil society, by politicians in Afghanistan, and by people in general. When President Karzai criticizes the national governments, that rings hollow because his own policies led to the situation that we are now in Afghanistan.
Do you believe that to be the case, Ali? And there have been some commentators, Afghan commentators, who are saying that President Karzai could be making an attempt at a political comeback.
Well, first of all, I would like to go back to what he said just a few minutes ago, like moments ago. I would like to call that what he said a bluff. He has issued hundreds of airstrikes to the Americans when he was the president. So saying all these or hearing all this from him is making someone laugh. And yes, of course, he's trying to undermine the national unity government. He has been engaged in ceaseless politicking, and you know, looking at the vulnerabilities of the two presidential or the two Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah. So yes, he's engaged in that.
If I may add, having again served for about a year inside the unity government, and having received reports from the US and NATO generals when accompanying the leadership on a weekly basis, what Mr. Karzai is saying here is absolutely incorrect, because the call comes from the Afghans. The Afghans call the shots at the end of the day. The Americans, NATO, and others who are giving advice, besides training, will come and tell you, well, this is what we think. But the decision is made by the Afghans. I have been witness to this, whether it's the president or chief executive or both of them together.
And that has always been the position?
And that has been the position for the past 2 years. So what he is saying is blatantly not correct.
Go ahead.
And if I just quickly can add also that President Obama recently relaxed the rules of engagement, some of those restrictions, based on requests from the Afghan government. Previously, the U.S. forces and also allied NATO forces were not targeting the Taliban, were not directly helping the Afghan security forces with air support. And as a result of that, that allowed the Taliban to gather en masse, sometimes in hundreds and thousands. They were able to capture the northern, the capital of northern province of Kunduz, and they were close to just capture the provincial capital of Helmand province, which was the center of the surge at the time as well. So they were just besieging the Afghan capital somehow. So that led the Afghan government to request the President Obama to relax some of the restrictions, to just increase some of their support, especially the air support, because the Afghan air force is almost non-existent at the time. They don't have the fighting capabilities, and that had increased their casualty rates as well. So this is not that the United States is very much in favor of expanding its engagement again, military engagement in Afghanistan again. They want the Afghans to lead all the security responsibilities, but because of some of these operational gaps that the Afghan security forces have, President Obama allowed that, and that again was based on the request of the Afghan government.